Welcome to the Ideal Spaces Working Group podcast.
Hello, Khalid.
Hi.
I'm Ulrich Gehmann from the Ideal Spaces Foundation, and today we have a podcast, a very interesting topic, with Khalid Kadir from the University of Berkeley in California. And Khalid, may you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, hello. It's great to be here, Ulrich, to chat with you again. I'm really excited about the work that you're doing and the ideas that you're bringing together here. I think what brought us today is, my interest in understanding sort of political economic change in the world today and understanding specifically how the individual and the self is being sort of transformed and shifted in our current moment of neoliberal capitalism, and the ways in which people move through the world differently, the ways in which people see themselves differently and they see others differently and they see their relationships to one another differently. And I'm interested in that in part because of how that shapes the forms of governance we live under and the kind of world that we share together. So most of my time is spent teaching. I teach a number of courses in political economy and on poverty, and a little bit trying to help those who are more technically oriented, engineers and developers, to understand the politics of their work and how their work shapes political outcomes. So that's a little bit about me and what I'm excited to talk about today.
That is, it sounds very interesting, and it relates, if I understood it properly, the issues you outlined, it relates to the very self-understanding in literal terms, also to the understanding of oneself about oneself.
It really does. And what's complicated for me about this is I want to be somewhat agnostic in terms of privileging what's better. Why is one version of the self, of the understanding of the self, better than another? I grew up at a certain time, and I grew up in a certain place and in a certain way that led to a certain understanding of the self in relation to others. And now that time is shifting rapidly. And I have an inclination to say, wait, this is destabilizing. This isn't, I don't like this. And I want to avoid critiquing it simply because it's different. At the same time, I think that some of the changes that are happening have real material and political consequence, in addition to personal, social, and spiritual consequences as well. And that makes me nervous. So I'm really, I'm concerned about, and it's interesting, this is happening in many ways, the individuation, the ways in which the primacy of the individual and the individual self in isolation from community and isolation from others, and this sort of focus so deeply on the individual self and the seeking for the individual self and the world revolving around oneself. I'm concerned about the sort of negative consequences that come with that, both in terms of like our collective, to the extent that that people are running around increasingly obsessed with, I think I can use that word, although it obviously comes with a kind of normative judgment there, obsessed with their individual selves. It's harder to see others, and it's harder to live in community with others when the focus is so deeply on the self. And that's has clearly obvious political consequences there that I think are taking us downward in a way.
These are two important directions you addressed. The first is related to the very self-understanding of the individual, and the other is the political consequences. If I'm concentrating on myself only, in disregard of the idea of community, and perhaps even in disregard of the concrete community I'm part of, this is a very important aspect in itself, because on the other hand, one could say this self exactly lost itself in terms of spirituality, of mindful consideration of the world around it. This is one direction, and the other direction is these political consequences. So both are very, very important directions. Perhaps you can outline both of them. So what is your concept?
Yeah. I think, when I think about the first one, maybe a side anecdote first, that I've seen recently an increased focus in what is called community psychology. And this is not a new field. It came about, my understanding is that it came about more or less in the 1960s, but it's starting to become a space of bigger focus. And there's among those who are in this space, there's a recognition that, yes, you as an individual, this is important. You have to work through your own psychological health. However, that focus on individuals, I think, has really failed us in a lot of ways. And the need to understand the communal nature of one's own individual psychology has sort of led to this sort of focus on a community psychology sort of approach. And I think that this is a response to overplaying the individual in terms of a psychological sense, and that we actually can't fix your problems and my problems in you and in me. That only happens when we address them collectively and together. And there's a need to understand the ways in which how we live together can have really, this sounds obvious when I'm saying it, but how we live together can have detrimental effects on us as individuals. And to see mental health struggles as an individual struggle, and you see it as an exception from the norm that has to be dealt with and brought back to the norm, it neglects the structural framing that, to what extent are mental health struggles actually community problems? That we have created this problem, and within community, we have the ability to address this problem. So I find that really interesting, and admittedly, this isn't based on some sort of social scientific survey, but in my own world, I see more and more people who are studying this or are choosing to study this. I think programs are growing in this space, and there's a bigger emphasis on this space. And I think that speaks to a recognition that we're not catching the things that we are identifying as struggles. We're not capturing them by focusing on individuals. And that this individual solution to everything, that you're responsible for your own self. This is a classic neoliberal framework, that every individual is responsible for themselves. Margaret Thatcher loved to say there's no such thing as community. There's only individual men and women, and there are families, and so I think this focus on the individual has really done a lot of damage. That it has really led us to, in one side, you can understand how it might be an empowering discourse, that people feel empowered to take control over the things in their own lives. But in the other hand, I see it as really fundamentally disempowering, because the only things that you have are yourself then. And you can never act collectively as community to address the things that are affecting many members in your community. And you can't address systemic inequalities. You can't solve them as individuals alone. By definition, they need broader social change. And so I think that this individuation and this focus on individuals has done a lot of damage, and the recognition of that damage is showing up in the way people are now focused more on community-oriented psychology, which psychology itself is very much about, the sort of positivist version is very much looking at what lights up in the brain when certain things happen, and thinking to see that discipline move to this community approach, to me, is a sign. It's interesting to me too that this focus on individuals and this individuation, when I think some of my work has been studying surveillance and securitization, particularly post September 11, 2001, when the security apparatus in the Western world, primarily in the United States, really shifted. And the way it works has shifted. And there's some great work by, I believe her name is Amour, looking at the individuation of individuals, that from a security standpoint, you are the net sum of all of your other interactions, and they break up people into pieces to try to draw a whole picture of a person. And those pieces are very much, it's even taking the individual and trying to capture, well, if I know these 200 things about you, now I know whether you're a terrorist or not. And these 200 things have to do with, like, where do you shop, and where do you go to for church or prayer or whatever, and where do you travel to, and the kind of things that the state surveillance apparatus can capture. And it's interesting, this reductive nature of what a person is, together with this static nature. There's this sense that like who are you can be identified, it can be named, and that's what you are. There's no sense of fluidity. And this is very much Western intellectual frameworks have
exactly
people. And no sense that people shift and change based on their social circumstance and their community circumstance and their age and their time in their life and all of these things. And I think that really creates tension inside of people, because now they either get boxed from outside or they box themselves. And then when things don't fit, they have struggles because things don't fit with that box.
Yeah, this is an interesting point, and as you addressed it, as this is in the line of the tradition of a, let's say, a Western scientific approach, isolating certain parameters, making up a person in their total. This is 17th century physics. This is very interesting, and the struggle these people get. Not fitting into this box, because no living being can fit into such boxes. You cannot put life into a box. This is one aspect. Then how this aspect relates, relates to this individuation, and this in a, let's say, neoliberal or modernist neoliberal context, concentrating on the individual in a kind of social Darwinism, to improve yourself, to optimize yourself. For instance, in the social media, we have influencers. We have ideal selves, constructed ideal selves, telling the other selves how they should become, how all this fits together.
Yeah. You know, I read a statistic that there are something like 127 million influencers worldwide. And it's just mind-boggling to me that this has become like a form of entrepreneurial, and it's become an entrepreneurial venture to become an influencer and to make money. And it's like, again, I try not to put judgment, but from a political economic view, it seems like baloney on top of baloney. Like it seems like the marketing frame gone to absurdity at some level. This like individualization plays an interesting role, because we think about as someone who is not wealthy, which is the vast majority of people in the world. They're not covering their housing, food, and whatnot because they're earning financial returns on investments. They are working in order to make money to survive. People who are laborers, who are workers, find themselves in an interesting conundrum because, and I'm really thinking about my students here, that to make themselves legible to the worlds of employment, they need to put themselves in a box as well. They need to look like they have some specialty and specific skills. And there's like this dance, because on one hand, you want to be like, I'm an expert in this, so you should hire me to do this. But on the other hand, you want to seem flexible, that you can learn new things and you can adapt. But ultimately, it's you have to have that thing to offer someone. So there's a reductiveness in what we look for in workers, or what is being looked for in workers. And I think that this really relates to, I mean, there's a lot of political economic work about the sort of the workers' sort of disenfranchisement from their working conditions. And this reductiveness does two things. One is it shuts off a part of the brain that you need to be really good at this singular thing, and you're not encouraged to think holistically and across spaces. You're certainly not encouraged to think politically about the work you're doing in the private sector, because that really undermines the ability to keep moving forward, to the extent that it's not leading towards more political justice. The other thing that I think it does is it makes people really sort of what's the word? It's like eventually you get timed out. Your usefulness goes away, because that thing that you specialized in is not a permanent need. And so there's a real, and we see this happen. This is not a new story. This happens as people age within workspaces, that what they learned and what they're good at is no longer valuable. And then that person becomes not valuable. And it's a really interesting thing when we start tying people's sense of self, the whole do what you love, like make sure you're pursuing your dreams and you're doing the thing that you're into. But then what happens when the world doesn't value that anymore? And then you become not valuable. And to the extent that you are, to the extent that this is wrapped up in your identity and your sense of self, but that is being valued and enumerated in value quite literally in financial terms, and that value is no longer there. Are you like no longer useful to society? Like people who don't have the newest skill become not useful to society almost definitionally. And I think this is a bit of a crisis, that people are only as valuable as their sort of economic contribution is part of what we're talking about here. That what they can bring in terms of financial value becomes tied to their own sense of personal value. And I think this is a major crisis sort of happening and waiting to get worse at some level, because it's a very reductive way of people to understand their sense of value and their sense of self. Not to mention all of the things that get lost in that. People who don't bring financial value are not seen as valuable. We suddenly lose so many things that markets don't see the need to pay for. And I think this is a really sort of perverse way of existing in many ways.
Yeah, this is a perverse way. When the world became a product and all the relevant life phenomena become a market or marketed. It's a way of utopia. Yeah.
And that's what an influencer is, right? An influencer is a product to sell other products. That's why it's kind of absurd. It's like, not only do you have to sell yourself as a product that people want to pay for, you're doing it to sell other products. And it's like, how many layers of commodification are we wrapped up in there, and to what end? To what's the ultimate benefit to anybody in this, and let alone all of the detriment, the inequality that it feeds into, the inequality that it makes visible to people. It sells people on dreams that aren't real. I mean, this was a concern of mine with sort of the rise in TV news and television, that we have the sense that to see is real. Susan Sontag writes about this, that the idea that seeing things makes them more real. But to photograph is to frame, and to frame is to exclude. That's a direct quote from her. And influencers exclude so much from their images, of course. Like it's obvious. You put something in a frame, you take other things out of it. But this gives us a perverted image of the world. It's not really the world. We don't see the parking ticket the influencer got when they drove to the beach, or when their car got a flat tire, and all the frustrations and the difficulty they had paying their bills. Like, all of that is left out, and life looks somehow perfect. And if your life doesn't look like that, you feel like something's wrong with you. So we've sold people on a false reality that they think everything is supposed to be fun and good and pretty and perfect all of the time. You're supposed to go to the beach and not get sand on you. And it's like, really? Like, how did that happen? You're at the beach.
Yeah, it's a kind of materialistic paradise, a pseudo paradise. No? The interesting aspect could be the relation between this self-understanding and the loss of the idea of community, and the loss the very consideration that in the end community is needed. How
Yeah.
this could relate to each other.
Yeah. You know, this one feels complicated to me because I think there are many things that are feeding into this loss of community. And you know, since the Industrial Revolution, people have been forced to move for work. And when people are forced to move for work, for livelihood, to sustain themselves, this is disruptive on communities because if you grow up in a place, you have your community relations, you have your neighbors. If something's wrong, you know who to go to, et cetera, et cetera. And now you move to another city where you don't have those relations and you don't have those same thick bonds with others that you can rely on in times of need. This is a isolating sort of practice at some level, and it is a community breaking practice that is not new. It is an old thing that has been happening really since the Industrial Revolution, but it is getting worse, and we're trying to fill those gaps sometimes with consumption, sometimes with like trying to develop new sorts of community. You know, we try to build community around the activities that we share. So we get together and on the internet, we find a group of people who all like hiking and we all go hiking. And this is, on one hand, it's beautiful. People are coming together. And I think it's always beautiful when people come together and share. But this is not a very thick community. The people that you come together with to go hiking are not the ones that you reach out to help you cover your rent when you lose your job. Like, that would be the unusual circumstance. Who's going to take care of you when you break your arm, you know? And or in fact, when you break your leg, you can't go hiking with them. And so now you're distant from that community. These are very thin bonds of community. They're not built out of mutual dependency, which is sticky and messy, but it builds thicker bonds when you share in that mutual dependency. We really cherish our independence today. And we see dependence in a negative framework. Nancy Fraser writes some beautiful piece on the genealogy of dependency and the ways in which dependency is stigmatized and seen as negative, and it's gendered, of course. This really is like, in an ironic way, it's stigmatizing and seeing negative sharing and living together in community. It's like you're seen as better when you are more independent, and you're seen as worse when you're more dependent. And it's really like it's an inversion from the sort of pre-industrial history of humanity, where dependency was the nature of things. And I think it's a hard jump to go from our deep independence to committing to living in with forms of dependence on one another, because that creates a vulnerability, and you have to know that you can rely on people. So this is a challenge that I see there.
Yeah, that's a good point. In this let's call it in this individuum-centered philosophy, this modern I am standing for myself philosophy. I have to be mistrusty against others because there is no real community I could depend on in a positive way. Yeah. Your hiking example, my hiking buddies all of a sudden will disappear when I break my leg, and that's it. And therefore, I cannot trust in other people, and therefore dependency becomes a negative thing. But is a world imaginable to draw some alternative scenarios where dependency is a positive value? As you had it in all pre-industrial societies, dependency was not only normal, it was also seen as a positive value and not at all only negative.
Yeah. And, you know, I think underneath that is a more traditional wisdom that, one, at different stages in life, we're all dependent. I mean, the nature of human procreation is that for the first many years of our lives, we are completely dependent because we would die otherwise. We need someone to feed us and to keep us safe and to clothe us and keep us warm and all these things. And similar things happen as we get older. And also during the intermediate life stages, if we're injured or sick, we are often dependent on others, and one example of this actually is the greatest. Let me make sure I say this properly. I'm thinking about some work by Jason Hickel. The greatest factor in increasing lifespans in the Western world was sanitation, was bringing sanitation. But this was not you and me independently handling our sanitation. This was a collective project that we all depended on one another. We depended on sharing resources to build networks of sanitation that enabled us to live longer. Like thinking about the ways in which building dependencies actually helps people live longer, like in this very basic way, really is to me very profound. That and I go back to thinking about Hobbes and life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. When you're living on your own as an individual and you have to be in competition with everybody, like we need not live that way. There is an element of choice. However, the political economic structures we live in make it hard to see that choice, and for many make it hard to make that choice. That I think there's a big, if I can think like a chemist, there's a big activation energy to move from a world of individuals all in competition with one another to move towards a world of communities, building in structures of interdependencies and collaboration and mutual support. That takes a major shift. I think it's easy to break that and it's hard to build it.
Yeah, the point is how to overcome the existing individuum-centered economic system and mindset altogether. It's not just an economic system as you outlined it. It's an entire mindset. People want to become self-optimized individuals. How to change this mindset and how to change the economy behind it is the final question then. Huh?
Yeah. That's a big one. And I don't claim to have any answers there, except that I think one process piece that I think about is, when we think about the institutions we build and the structures we build, a simple question is like, do we, and I'm pulling off of the work of Kivel is his name. Do we bring people together? Does our work bring people together, or does our work divide people apart? And I think that's like one very simple question that we can ask of the things we're doing and strive towards things that bring people together and bring people closer rather than things that divide people apart.
Mm-hmm. And how could be this translated into economic terms of survival in that way? Could we earn our living by doing this new kind of work?
I think part of me wants to say, well, we have to find ways to do it. I think some of the interesting experiments that I've seen on this, there's a large sort of subculture focus on sort of demonetizing people's lives and recognizing the ways in which capitalistic money-based systems really divide people and they really split people apart. And so one effort, and Jeff Mann writes a little bit about this too, is how can we demonetize our existence to the extent that our needs are not depending on first getting money and then we can get those basic needs met? Can we build more systems of exchange and trade and sharing and et cetera, all the words that get co-opted in our sort of capitalist framework? The sharing economy is nothing to do with sharing. It has to do with siphoning money upwards, but it gets under the rubric of sharing. But can we really share? Can we really build community relations with one another where and there's a collective and an individual part with this. The collective part is perhaps obvious. How do we live more in community with one another and our relationship is not connected through money? That's one piece of it. The individual part is how do we distance ourselves from our attachment to things and to accumulation of wealth? And that's a big challenge when so much of the tidal wave is pushing you to go the other way. You know, if you're on Instagram or TikTok, you see the sort of allure of more and of things and of consumption, and or you turn on the TV or you surf the internet and you're attacked with ads constantly. Like, this requires a kind of spiritual discipline to go upwards against. And there are also technical tools. You can put an ad blocker in and things like that, and that helps. But really thinking about how might we demonetize our life. And I think that is really at the root of any sort of solutions there.
That's a very interesting point. No? How to
and this relates to, I want to note, this relates to the very nature of money in the world today, that money is created by banks loaning out money in debt. Like the root of the creation of money is debt, and it's interest-based debt. And interest-based debt is rooted in nonstop growth, of endless growth. So I think that we need to get away from that paradigm because it's destroying the environment. It's dependent on putting people in debt. So now they have a kind of attachment to money and servitude in order to repay those debts. And so I think that the farther we can get away from money as it exists today, the better off we are.
Yeah, that's an important statement. It's a profound statement. How to arrive at such new type of economy, no?
Yeah. I think well, one is to the extent we can build relationships that are not mediated through transactions and through money. I think another one that personally for me that I struggle with is we can't be moving all the time. This may sound like a crazy statement to say, but like, you know, here in the United States, if it's at least in specifically here, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area. Like, I don't know the percentages, but it feels like most people around me aren't from here. And it could be that I've only been here for 20 some years, and maybe the people I know are more transitional. But to the extent we come and go from places and move to chase work, and when jobs move, we move, and it's destabilizing for communities. You don't build in the same way. And I think there's a real challenge. And this actually comes up with an issue that Europe is facing. You know, many of the people moving to Europe are forced migrants. They are forced to move because of economic deprivation or political assault of some sort. And what's interesting to me is the first thing those people do is try to rebuild community amongst each other who speak similar languages and share foods, but also share like common struggles. And the first thing that many European nations try to do is break them apart because they use the language of integration. But what that means is we're trying to break that community and integrate them with our money-based sort of way of interacting with one another. And you see this really interesting thing happen. Young people love going to the part of town where all the foreigners live. It's hip, it's cool. And I think one of the reasons for that is because they sense there's something else there. There's a bond there that exists between people that is not purely based on financial gain. There's a different kind of humanity that exists there. And it's ironic that so many Western nations are trying to break that apart while simultaneously people are looking for it and seeking it.
This is a paradox. We are looking for skilled workers, and at the same time we have this adversive position against immigrants. Next to the systemic problems we have also to address, also there are clan criminality, etc., etc. But the very issue is this mindset, as you out. The people have to be brought back to be perfect individuals in the existing system. Why they do not realize? It's this influencer question again. Why they do not realize that this perfect, isolated, self-sustained individual is an illusion, is not to be reached, at least for the vast majority of people.
Well, I have first a question. At what age did you realize that? You know, there's a little bit of life experience involved there, right?
Yeah.
And I would imagine that your life experience is partly informed by having had deeper community relations.
Exactly.
But if you grew up without that, it's hard for you. How do you know the thing that you don't know? Like this is a sort of existential question for teachers. How do you or researchers as well, how do you see the thing you can't see? If you don't even know it is a thing to know, how do you start going about knowing it? I think this is a real challenge so I don't blame those influencers and those folks who are trying to climb this ladder and caught up in this game, because I don't see it as their fault. I do think they are reproducing the problem, yes, but I don't know. I'd be interested to find folks who are, I mean, I'm sure the articles are coming soon. The ex-influencer, the recovered influencer. I'm sure this phenomenon is coming if it is not already there. And like the emptiness they found when their whole life was built around likes and not just their psychological life, because that's a thing we know. People really obsess about how many people like my post on Facebook or whatever it is, but their actual material existence is tied to how many followers and how many likes they have. Like their value is literally translated into financial terms through the mediation of these platforms, which themselves are taking the majority cut. So any dollar that an influencer makes, the platform's certainly making money. They're not doing that for free. And so there's this kind of parasitic extraction on humans that's happening. So I don't really blame those influencers, is what I'm getting at here. But how do we? I think the need to build more spaces where people can find common humanity and common cause will help people to see alternative possibilities. You know, one thing I say to my students at the beginning of each semester in my political economy classes, one of the goals of my class is to render the world strange. Because to the extent that the world, everything seems normal and right, we accept the problems as normal and right. To the extent that climate change is just a normal and real thing, we don't do a lot to change it. But to the extent we recognize the strangeness of humans heating up the climate, it might help us say, no, actually, we don't want to do that. We want to do better, you know? And I think to the extent we see neoliberal capitalism as normal, well, if you grew up from the 80s onward, that's all you really know. Like that's been your whole existence. Can you render that strange and thereby create the possibilities of creating an alternative, seeing that this is really strange and weird. We don't want this. We want something different. But if it's the only thing you know, that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, it's a lack of experience in a deeper meaning of what is experience. No? And yeah, this trying to summarize what you outlined up to now.
Yeah.
In your eyes, what is the major problem that has to be solved in order to approach, to be solved in which direction, to approach a more human life in the end, and coming away from this new version of Herbert Spencer in with conditions.
Yeah. It's like a chicken and egg question for me, because the one hand, I want to say there's this need for a massive political economic shift. But how do you bring about and make clear the need for this shift without also changing individuals? So it's like, what comes first? I don't know. Maybe both happen at the same time, more likely. On one hand, there's a need for a major political economic shift away from growth, away from consumption, away from extraction, away from lives that are dependent on monetization and now increasingly on financialization. We need to move away from that. But at the same time, I think part of what's going to be necessary is that there also needs to be like a spiritual shift. Ultimately, I really think that ultimately it's going to require a spiritual shift in understanding like what it means to be a person. Because if what it means to be a person is just to consume, like then we're going to keep on this track. But if we have different sense of spiritual purpose, that's not just about entertainment, it's not just about distraction. I think that's a thing that happens. That's a shift that happens inside of people. It's certainly fostered and encouraged by efforts beyond the individual, but it really is a degree of individual transformation. So I think both need to happen, and we need to work towards both at the same time.
Mm-hmm. What has to be happen that its shift will occur? Normally, to make it bluntly, normally in history, as these changes inside the individual only took place in times of despair and of poverty and of disruption in the end.
Yeah. And that can go bad, right? People in times of despair, destruction, and poverty can really do some crazy things and really antisocial things and harmful things. So I think on the back of crises, which is a loaded term, on the back of crises, change happens. I mean, Milton Friedman recognized it, so do others, and they often take advantage of crises. But I'm hopeful that it does not require us to hit the proverbial rock bottom in order to make such changes. And I'm concerned about that. However, I think about political economic, the 20th century, the major political economic shift that happened in the 20th century happened on the back of World War II. And I don't posit that we have to have World War III in order to bring about another change. I don't think that's the case, but I do fear that to the extent people can continue surviving, and despite how miserable the survival is, that things don't change. That's a concern of mine. That, like, I agree that it's going to take. What is it? Let me maybe frame it in a different way. Every human being goes through different kinds of crises at different times in their life. And I think those micro crises, if we can call them that, or individual crises, are always opportunities for growth and change. You are driving too fast and you bump into a parked car. No one gets hurt. This is a moment that shakes you up, and you're like, I need to slow down. Like, it wakes you up, and so even these kind of small things that happen in our lives, and there's something beautiful about the world, the way in which it keeps us in check. When we overextend ourselves, we receive that feedback that you're overextended because you trip and you fall or something like that. And so my hope is that humans can pay attention to the things happening in their life and and find balance within that. My concern sort of lies in the political economic frame. Frederick Douglass has a famous saying: "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." This is what's commonly quoted, but he goes on and he says, and I'm going to paraphrase, I won't direct quote him. He says, if you find out just how much people will quietly go along with, then you'll find out the exact amount of injustice that will be enacted upon them. Because once you go too far, people will push back. So people will put up with a certain amount of injustice quietly, and that's the amount of injustice they will receive. So I think there's a need to not put up with it anymore. To the extent that we refuse to allow the degradation of our communities, of our families, of our environment, like, to the extent that we no longer accept that, then we'll see change. I think about things like microplastics or PFAS. If we decide we don't want that anymore, for sure we can make that happen. But we have to decide we don't want it anymore. that we don't want the pain and the suffering that comes from the destruction of the environment, and then we'll stop destroying the environment because we'll say, no, this is enough. But at some level, we put up with it because we accept it, we normalize it. So I think that it will require both individual spiritual transformation that I'm hopeful doesn't require massive crises, but is possible through a reflective life and seeing the things that are going on in one's own life. And at the same time, it will require a political economic struggle that will not happen without struggle and without pushback, rooted in no longer accepting the kinds of harm that we currently accept around us today.
And this would presuppose, amongst other things, this would presuppose that individuals are recognizing the illusion in the existing system. This, let's say, this illusion of self-optimization.
Yeah, totally. And you know that's why I asked you that question about what age did you see this, because I feel like, you know, there's a when you're if you are young and healthy and strong and resilient, and you know you trip and fall and you get a cut and the cut heals quickly, no problem. But as you get older, that changes. And you don't heal as fast, and you start to say, well, actually, I don't want to trip and fall again because it's not going to go away as quickly. And I think there is a certain kind of wisdom that comes with experience. And this is interesting because another thing that has enabled this process to happen is we've sidelined people as they get older. Like we've totally inverted every traditional paradigm that held up the elders as the center of society. In the Western world, elders are the peripheral of society, and we treat them as though they're a drain on society. They contribute nothing to GDP, as Wendy Brown points out, and they cost us a lot of money in healthcare. It's such a perverse thing to approach elders in this way, and we lose because of it. We lost all of the wisdom that comes from no longer upholding those older generations who have that wisdom.
It's an inhuman mindset, and in addition, it is in terms of bare survival, also individual survival. It is not wise not to trust on experience, but if I am living as an individual in the eternal present of a consumer society, of one wave of pseudo excitement hunting the next wave, I have no time for looking at myself. I have no time to consider experience and history, because in this permanent flow of the always newest, there is no history and there's no time.
And this actually tells you why the system is stable in reproducing itself, because the forces that might undermine the system are and this is the nature of stable regimes, that they operate in the way that they prevent change from happening, and they are able to buffer critique. And a system that is accelerationist and moves as fast as it does, it prevents us from slowing down and thinking, because if I'm slowing down and thinking, then I'm not paying my rent. And so like this is happening in microfields too. Academics are constantly complaining about this. I saw an article the other day, scientists need more time to think because they're not thinking. And it's like, what happens when we're not thinking? Like, that's a major problem if we're not thinking, you know?
But what scientists are doing when they are not thinking? They are producing what?
Yeah, totally. They're producing things that are actually net harmful, right? And they're reproducing systems that are net harmful. What
are the political consequences in your eyes? Or what has to be changed in the political field to achieve that change towards a real reconsideration of a self in the direction you outlined it, of community, of demonetizing your life? It's a premise to find yourself in the end.
It is. I think on the political side of things, I think that the sort of collective thinking is one piece of this. I think moving away from a growth paradigm, which is happening. There's like the no growth models in Europe, especially. This conversation is much more alive than it is here in the States. This idea that we need to move away from a growth as defined by GDP increasing model, which is just nonsensical. Like, anyone who spends any amount of time with it, the discussion is, can we dematerialize growth? And the overwhelming answer that I see is no. Like our economic growth is tied to our material realities, and that we are going to eat up the entire world if we don't get away from this. And so I think that there's a need to move away from a growth paradigm. And I'm intrigued, and I'm still sort of thinking through this. I'm intrigued by ideas around pluralism, almost as opposed to multiculturalism, to think about what might it mean to live pluralistically, where kind of a live and let live framework. And other scholars, Arturo Escobar and others, have written a lot about the pluriverse and what that might look like, partly in response to the sort of Western hegemonic project of development, trying to refashion the entire world around the Western capitalist model. So it's sort of a post-development orientation. Mm-hmm. But this idea of like a radical alternative vision around a pluriverse is something that I find intriguing. And there they explore everything from they look at ideas that are not pluralistic, that are universalistic, like the BRICS, or geoengineering, or green economies, or smart cities, or sustainable development. These are all sort of universalizing ideas. And instead they say, well, can we look at transformative ideas that aren't trying to universalize the world? Everything from the Zapatistas and to liberation theology, to gift economies, to food sovereignty, to ecofeminism, to buen vivir. Like, these are all initiatives that are seeking to transform the way we live, not to universalize and force everyone under a single model. So this is the kind of thing that I'm most intrigued by now. Still struggling to see practically how that manifests, but it is where sort of my leading edge is for me personally right now.
And it's a good perspective for the future. No?
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you very much for this podcast, and I think we should consider both as ideal spaces, and in your work also. Perhaps we can find some projects to make together in this new direction. It would be worth the effort.
Yeah, I think so too. I actually think any efforts to move in this direction, whether they succeed or fail, are worth the effort. By definition, I think it's worth the effort. And I think the success is in making the effort. And I appreciate you making these spaces to think through this. This is, I mean, if my all over the place thinking betrays that, it's still it's hard to conceptualize when you're living in the midst of contested territory, and when your own survival on one hand depends on reproducing the system, but you're simultaneously trying to extract yourself from it. And I live in the Bay Area. I rent a place that I live, and I have to continue paying that rent. And these struggles are the fastest pathways to surviving that are ultimately pathways that lead to collective destruction, in my view. So how do you both live in it but move away from it is a thing that I'm constantly thinking about. And being able to be in conversation with you about this, I always find it helpful and illuminating.
Okay. Many thanks, Khalid.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Khalid, off the record, I will put on the camera. I will finish the recording. Okay.
Great.
Yo, and I will. Here we see us again. Okay. No, really, this it is worth the effort. As I want to continue collaborating with you in these directions you mentioned, because my personal aim for our foundation is that we will provide a forum for concrete projects in the directions you mentioned, without getting into ideologizing. Because what I'm afraid of, on the one hand, we have this, at least in large parts of Europe, we have this green ideology. As a green, there are many good approaches, but green means also as it can become a quasi religion. And on the other hand, we have all these bloody right-wing movements. This is incredible.
And you know, there's this real challenge, because how do you, I feel like the green ideology, that in the way it becomes like a weird thing, it's rooted in some good principles, but when it enters into the world of mass party politics, it becomes unrecognizable. And this is the challenge. Yeah. I do wonder about, I actually believe that scale is the enemy of good work. I don't think we can just come up with something and scale it up and that's the answer to the world.
Thank you.